From an apartheid pariah state to a nation among a community of nations, South Africa's return to the international community after the end of apartheid in 1994 was welcomed and met with a view on advocating for multilateralism, the advancement of human rights, the promotion of peace and justice and democracy amongst the pillars on which the country's foreign policy rested. But has it achieved these goals? Welcome to Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. Thank you so much for joining us. On this episode, we ask, has South Africa managed to successfully reset its image in Africa and the world since 1994? Joining us for this discussion are Dr. Philani Mthembu, the Executive Director for the Institute for Global Dialogue, Ambassador Kingsley Makhubela, the former South African ambassador to Portugal and Kenya, amongst others, and has represented the country in various conflict areas and was the CEO of Brand South Africa. And from Northern Ireland, we are joined by Declan Kearney, member of the Irish Legislature Assembly and the national chairperson of the Sinn Fein Political Party. But first, before we begin the conversation, let's have a look at this insert put together by our producer, Nadia Dambuza.
The millions across our globe who stand expectant at the gates of hope look to this organization to bring them peace, to bring them life, to bring them a life worth living.
Delivering his inaugural speech at the United Nations after being elected first democratic president of South Africa, President Nelson Mandela set the tone about South Africa's foreign policy as the country was re-entering the international stage. Mandela crisscrossed the world in his government's drive to promote this new world order. Similarly, world leaders were keen to visit South Africa.
I am an African.
Nelson Mandela's successor, former President Thabo Mbeki, would later pay a sharper focus on Africa's development agenda through his notion of the African Renaissance. South Africa became involved in peacekeeping missions in countries such as Burundi, Sudan and the DRC. And the country, along with 4 other African states, was at the forefront of developing the new Partnership for Africa's Development, which was officially adopted by the African Union in 2001. But the honeymoon began waning as observers started questioning South Africa's inconsistent foreign policy decisions, such as its non-interference and quiet diplomacy approach on Zimbabwe, at the time when the opposition members experienced large-scale human rights abuses and political repression by the ZANU-PF government.
People were opposed to injustice and oppression, and people believed that we South Africans would automatically be on the side of those who were being oppressed. Tibet is being oppressed.
South Africa had once again shocked the world by denying the Tibetan spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, a visa for the 3rd time due to its fear of upsetting the Chinese government, which refuses to recognize Tibet's rights to independence. The contradictions persisted later, with the country receiving international condemnation for refusing to arrest then war crimes accused Sudanese President al-Bashir, thereby violating its international law obligations. South Africa's National Development Plan acknowledged that the country experienced a decline in power and influence in world affairs, stating that in the Southern African region, the country was perceived as a self-interested bully acting in bad faith. Internationally, it received criticism over its voting record at the UN Security Council, which some saw as a tacit support for repressive regimes. The country further suffered reputational damage during the early stages of the 2022 Ukraine-Russian conflict. The International Relations Department initially condemned Russia, calling on the country to immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine in line with the United Nations Charter, but later retreated to its professed non-aligned position. The groundswell support it received from around the world following its case against Israel at the International Court of Justice for breaching international law in Gaza gave South Africa its much-needed moral boost. Nadia Dambuza, Democracy 30.
And thank you so much for being with us. I perhaps want to start the conversation with you, Ambassador Makhubela. Thank you so much for being with us. Perhaps take us to the early days of South Africa's democracy. How much of what was then the building blocks of South Africa's diplomatic community, how much of their concern and their mental real estate was spent thinking about South Africa's brand image and South Africa's perception the world over, and how much of our diplomatic efforts at the time was about reshaping that?
Well, thank you very much, Oliver, and really good to see Mthembu and Declan from Northern Ireland. You know, the South African foreign policy from its inception was anchored on what we used to call consolidation of the African agenda. And that consolidation of the African agenda meant the resolution of conflict in the continent, meant setting up standard for governance in the country, and self-reflection in terms of how African governments were performing. Hence, the transformation of the OAU to the African Union and the inclusion of a variety of mechanisms to try to measure this, for instance, the peer review mechanisms and so on. That's how the South African policy was anchored on. And because of this focus on the consolidation of the African agenda, South Africa was invited to different forums around the world. The G20 is among them. Because if you look at the G20, it's a composition of the $1 trillion club GDP, and South Africa was far from that. And it was included on this group on the understanding that it carries the aspiration and represents the aspiration of the African continent.
Yeah, Dr. Mthembu, I can't imagine that it would be easy to talk about what South Africa's diplomatic and geopolitical perception is around the world. It's a storied and complex one. But I want you to talk to us about how it may have evolved over the last 30 years of our democracy. Where do you think the starting point of it was, and where does it find itself today?
I think the foundation is the way in which we handled our transition away from apartheid, creating a democratic country, adopting a progressive constitution. That in itself, with its Bill of Rights, which guarantees citizens, access to basic services, water, electricity, but also the right to vote. And I think that became a source of soft power to consolidate South Africa's democratic order. It had a resonance, I think, to citizens, citizens especially within the continent and beyond. And over time, I think when the South African economy was doing well, when the economy was, growing at 4%, 5%, you had relative stability. South Africa could also invest in its international commitments, especially peacekeeping in Africa, especially also through your African Renaissance Fund, addressing the root causes of development within the continent. At that period, certainly there was a lot of positive sentiment towards the country. What may have altered that over time is when the country went through its own domestic challenges, governance challenges, service delivery challenges, things such as the mismanagement of migration policy, and what may have also led to attacks on African foreign nationals. Those are the type of things that then began to dent South Africa's image on the continent and even beyond. So what that tells you is that when South Africa has its house in order, its economy is functioning, its institutions are working, that tends to have a positive influence on how people perceive the country. But when its own house is in order, its own economy is struggling, it's unable to invest in the provision of various goods within the continent, then it takes a hit to start finding a divergence.
Yeah. Declan, 30 years is a very long time, but if you read the South African story in international publications, if you follow the South African story on broadcast channels like the BBC and CNN, you often get a story of a country in a crisis of crime, a country in a crisis of corruption, and a country that has its political foundation split apart by domestic political infighting. And that is at least how we think the world sees South Africa. How does the rest of the world, from the vantage point of a country in Europe like yourself, see South Africa and the South African story over the last 30 years?
Quite distinct from the perspective that may be promoted among some of those Western news channels. Our perspective on South Africa would be one which sees it in context with the national liberation struggle, the achievement of national democracy and the foundation of a rainbow nation, and the centrality of people's power, popular mobilisation and national self-determination to achieving that. Then and since and to this day, South Africa is a source of inspiration and hope for freedom-loving peoples all over the world. And that stands to the integrity of the vision that was set out not only in the Freedom Charter, but the leadership, the iconic leadership that was shown by Madiba and so many others at the time of liberation. I think it's also important to note that in the period since, South Africa has followed a clearly defined, non-aligned foreign policy. And as a result, I believe that South Africa has successfully changed the paradigm of international relations between the global north and the global south. And what I mean by that is South Africa has asserted the centrality of a multipolar world and the need for us to manage international relations clearly on the basis of multipolarity and also multilateralism. And that leads me to my last point, and it is to say this. I believe that today South Africa has firmly established itself as a global moral superpower, as a direct result of the courageous leadership which has been shown by the South African government in taking its case under the Genocide Convention to The Hague, to the International Court of Justice, standing up and beside the Palestinian people in the midst of this genocidal war which is being carried out against them by the Israeli state. And all of these are factors that need to be taken into wider consideration, and they certainly influence the view of myself and others and those of us in the progressive democratic spectrum of political opinion here in the global north and in the Western world.
Yeah, perhaps to ask this question, and we lost Ambassador Makhubela there, and I perhaps also wanted him to address this. No country has a linear story when it comes to international affairs, international relations, geopolitics, and certainly not its image in the international community. South Africa is no exception to that. We have a complex and perhaps even complicated story such as that. How do you contrast the courage that Declan Kearney speaks about here of taking Israel to the International Court of Justice and pursuing justice on behalf of the Palestinian people on the one hand, but refusing a few years prior to arrest Bashar al-Assad, for instance, who was also wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes, or on the same score, not voting with the entire United Nations, majority of the United Nations, on sanctioning and both physically, both literally, but also morally, Russia's invasion. That seems like a clear contradiction to, at first glance, in the international community.
I think firstly it's important to note that there is a long history of internationalism when it comes to South Africa, the key actors that lead the country. So the ANC prior to 1994 was essentially at the center of creating the largest social justice movement in the world in the form of the anti-apartheid movement. So those progressive values were shaped, during that time. Fast forward in government, you pointed out some contradictions that may emerge in foreign policy. At times, like the case with al-Bashir, at times that was very specific reasons. So at the time, al-Bashir was coming into the country for an African Union summit. And the legal advice that at least the state had received was that he should have diplomatic immunity. Part of the reason that was given was that it would be important to meet with him to essentially negotiate peace in Sudan. And so there was a reason, but also at the time that was not properly, I think, communicated with the international community. At the time, we must also remember that there was growing critique towards the International Criminal Court. Increasingly, the International Criminal Court was being questioned for targeting only Africans and being inconsistent on other cases. And indeed, for a period of time, there was even discussion about South Africa exiting the International Criminal Court. That was subsequently reversed because South Africa and the governing party made the decision it is better to fight for the reform of the ICC from within, whilst continuing to pursue cases, as we've seen, trying to hold the state of Israel accountable. So contradictions do emerge, but at times they have been mishandled, and at times they've been handled a bit better.
Yeah. We'll continue the conversation on the other side of this break. Don't go away. And welcome back to Democracy 30. Tonight we ask the question, has South Africa managed to successfully reset its image in the international community over the last 30 years of our democracy? Before we went to the break there, we were talking about the complexities of international affairs. And I just want to get your view on this, Ambassador Makhubela, where South Africa has found itself in really difficult positions, perhaps as a friend of a country that is in an unfavorable position. Let's take the 2008 Zimbabwe elections as an example, for instance, 2006 rather, Zimbabwe elections as an example, for instance, or for instance, the visit of Omar al-Bashir that we had just spoken about here as an example, or perhaps where South Africa had the opportunity to play the role of an interlocutor in two warring parties, two warring countries, and perhaps even, you know, like if you take a look at Ethiopia, for instance, as an interlocutor in resolving ethnic war there. Have we managed those complexities with the necessary sensitivity that safeguards the integrity of the matter at hand, but also South Africa's image and its participation therein?
No, just on the al-Bashir matter, that was the darkest period in our democracy. Because once you sign international instruments, you must understand the implications. Because the Rome Statute makes it quite clear that heads of state will not enjoy immunities with respect to 4 crimes that are under, I think, Article 5 of the Rome Statute. Genocide, war of aggression, crime against humanity. You know, those are issues that they don't enjoy. And we've migrated international law in our domestic law. That was a violation of the law by the South African government. And at that stage, would have expected the president actually to be impeached for that because he failed to arrest al-Bashir. And we can't speak about the rule of law. When it's convenient, we avoid it. That's one. With respect to the problem across the border in Zimbabwe, it's just unfortunate that people don't understand the dynamics because South Africa has been worried about the implosion of Zimbabwe, what kind of implications it would have on South Africa. And it came at a time when the Western government were advocating for regime change around the world. And South Africa was hesitant, and rightfully so, not compliant with that. South Africa will be impacted.
I'm just going to pause you there because I think we have a double feed of your audio there, which creates quite an unfortunate echo. We will try and sort that out. But while we do get that sorted out, Declan, perhaps I want to ask you this. There is an emerging conversation in international affairs that multilateralism is in danger at the moment in 2024. The world is becoming increasingly polarized. That is to say, the emergence of right-wing political sentiments that seem to split and take away the impact of multilateral bodies is finding a lot more of a platform. Does South Africa have with it the political wherewithal and moral authority to be able to hold multilateralism together wherever it may find itself participating in multilateral fora and multilateral organizations?
The question is
for Mr. Kearney. Declan, that's for you.
Oh, thank you. I think that South Africa has both a strategic and a political duty to ensure that the integrity of multilateral institutions is in fact upheld. Because you're quite right to assess that at this particular point in time, there is an all-out assault upon the integrity of international humanitarian law, the United Nations Charter, and South Africa has correctly stated that there is a requirement to introduce a reform of the United Nations itself. And I believe that the South African government, through fora such as the African Union, when it comes to chair the G20, must take forward an alternative progressive narrative that at this point in time in international relations, at a time when there are so many existential threats to national sovereignty, to international law, that South Africa must stand up, as it has done in relation to the case of Western Sahara, Sudan, the stance that it has taken on behalf of the Palestinian people, and indeed the support that the ANC in government has historically shown to the cause of Irish national self-determination. We here in the progressive Western world certainly look to South Africa to continue to carry the mantle of progressive internationalism, of multilateralism, and to ensure that the attempt to craft a narrative of a binary set of international relations, polarizing between the northern, the global north and the global south, is displaced with not only a narrative, but a form of political diplomacy which places the multipolar world at its center.
Yeah. Dr. Mthembu, perhaps to bring this question to you. Have we, in earnest, made the right sort of decisions about who we choose to be friends with and how we choose to be friends with them? I want to bring two, maybe three examples in contrast for you here. When Greece was going through its sovereign debt default crisis many years ago, South Africa, with the rest of the EU, made monetary donations to Greece, right? South Africa gave a 2 billion rand donation to the Greece fiscus at the time. More recently, during COVID, South Africa brought on board Cuban doctors at quite an exorbitant cost to the fiscus. But meanwhile, Zimbabwe continues to have an ailing and failing economy, yet not a similar sort of posturing is seen to be done in specifically humanitarian aid and assistance to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is one example. We could look at multiple other examples on the continent. Is it a case of we like to look nice for the global north and we like to look nice for our friends in Southern and Northern America, but not so much for our friends on the continent? Have we chosen the right friends, and do we show up for them correctly?
So, I mean, since the dawn of our democracy, I think President Mandela made it clear that no one should essentially force South Africa to say who its friends are. You should not say your enemies should be South Africa's enemies. And so South Africa has always maintained a degree of non-alignment. So it has tried to essentially engage everyone, especially amongst the great powers. The perception that South Africa at times is more focused on perhaps other international struggles, solidarity struggles, than perhaps African obligations. At times, it is not necessarily reflected in the reality. If we look at, for instance, South Africa's commitments in terms of the African Renaissance Fund, most of the funds that come from the African Renaissance Fund are destined for African countries, including Zimbabwe at some point was receiving, for instance, South African grain during the time when it was facing famine. So there is indeed solidarity towards, African causes. You could also bring into the equation peacekeeping missions, whether it's in Mozambique, whether it's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, South Africa's role in South Sudan, South Africa's role in Ethiopia. So South Africa is very engaged in Africa. The challenge is that when the South African economy took a knock from 2008, it has not been able to invest as much as it was investing on the continent prior to 2008. And that has also been followed by the perception that South Africa is declining in terms of its engagement in Africa. And part of the challenge of the first administration of President Ramaphosa was to try and regain and rebuild what you could call lost ground on the African continent. But that has to be accompanied with a growing economy.
Perhaps, Ambassador Makhubela, where do you see, as someone who's been a part of the diplomatic machinery of South Africa, both internally and externally, where do you see South Africa's image in the international community going over the next 30 years?
Declan is quite correct that one of the things that we must deal with is the challenge of implementing.
Oh, Ambassador Makhubela, we had lost your line there. Perhaps to ask you a similar question, Declan, how do you see South Africa's image evolve over the next 30 years of international affairs and geopolitics?
I think that South Africa has a very important role to play in the coming period. As we face into so many existential crises, as we see an upsurge in colonialism and imperial interests, not only in across Africa but throughout the Middle East. And South Africa came into being, as I said earlier, with a leadership which was bestowed by Madiba and so many others who were to the fore of the liberation struggle. I think they set out a very clear vision. South Africa's responsibility was...
Unfortunately, Mr. Kearney, I am going to have to leave it there. That's all the time we have, for we have unfortunately come to the end there. But I do think that early vision, Madiba said, that you outline as the building blocks of South Africa's democracy is astute. Perhaps to tell you this, since April this year, we have reflected on the social, political and economic aspects of the past 30 years of our democracy. Today was our last program of Democracy 30, but we hope that we have managed to give you a perspective that accurately reflects the different dimensions and complexities of South Africa's 30 years old maturing democracy. The team that put this together was Busisiwe Ntuli, Nadia Dambuza, Lieven Mhlari, Johannes Tugwana, and myself, Oliver Dixon. From us, it's been an absolute honor and pleasure with you since April this year. Thank you so much for your time. It's good night.